I was 52 when everything began to shift. It wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was more like the slow drifting of tectonic plates, the kind you only notice when the ground beneath you is no longer where you thought it was. I had been married to Paul for almost 30 years. We had two grown children who had left the nest with more grace than I expected, and, in their place, came the silence of the house and the noise in my head.
Paul was a good man. He still is.
Reliable, honest, attentive in the way men of his generation are, dutiful, structured, emotionally efficient. We had our rhythms: dinners at 7, the Saturday market, wine on the porch during the warmer months. Sex had become as routine as the rest of it, quiet, respectful, and in recent years, increasingly rare.
I wasn't angry about it.
That would have meant I still cared enough to be angry. Mostly, I felt invisible, not just to him, but to myself. I didn't plan for any of this. I didn't wake up and think, today I'll betray my husband.
No.
It crept in like water under a door you forgot to seal. Quiet, persistent, inevitable. The weekend it began. We were hosting a late summer family barbecue. Paul's father had remarried when Paul was already in his 20s, and his new wife came with a son from a previous marriage, Evan. Evan was 12 years younger than me, closer to our kids' age than ours, and yet, technically my stepbrother. He wasn't a regular presence in our lives. I'd seen him maybe 3 or 4 times in the last decade, always at family events. He lived out west, some tech consulting thing that I never paid much attention to. But this time he was passing through town for work and was invited, casually, by Paul's stepmother. When Evan walked into our backyard that Saturday afternoon, I felt it like a ripple in my skin. He was taller than I remembered, broader, with a quiet confidence that didn't beg for attention but had the effect of drawing every gaze anyway. His hair was just touched with gray at the temples, unfairly flattering, and his eyes, a kind of smoky hazel, met mine without hesitation. Not in a leering way, not immediately, just direct, like he recognized something in me. Or maybe I imagined that. We hugged politely, and when he said, "Hey Laura, it's been a long time," I felt the warmth in my chest rise in a way that had nothing to do with the August sun. "Too long," I said, smiling more widely than I'd meant to. "You've changed."
You haven't, he replied.
He said it so smoothly, so easily that I laughed.
But something inside me stilled.
I had changed, of course I had. I had stretch marks and smile lines and a softness around the middle that used to embarrass me when I caught my reflection getting out of the shower. But he said it like he meant it, and that stirred something in me that had been asleep for too long. The rest of the afternoon went by in the usual blur of potato salad, laughter, and second glasses of wine. Evan stayed near me more than I expected, helping me refill the ice bucket, asking about our kids, joking about how grown-up everything felt. It wasn't flirtation. Not yet. Just the kind of warm attentiveness I hadn't felt in years. Later, after the last guest had left and Paul had gone to bed early with a mild headache, I sat out on the back porch with Evan, the citronella candles flickering low. The conversation had drifted into deeper water: relationships, life, regret. He asked if I was happy. It was a simple question. I could have lied. I think I tried to. "I have a good life," I said, staring into the wine glass. That's not what I asked. The way he looked at me then, steady, without pity or judgment, made my skin warm under my blouse. It had been a long time since anyone looked at me like that. Not just seen me, but looked. "You always had this energy," he said quietly, "when I was younger. You'd walk into a room, and everything changed a little. Even Paul stood straighter." I let out a breath. That was a long time ago. I still see it. It wasn't the words. It was the tone. The weight of them. Like he wasn't saying it for effect. Like he needed me to hear it. That night I lay in bed next to Paul, wide awake, staring at the ceiling fan. I wasn't thinking about what Evan said. I was thinking about how he said it. How his hand had brushed mine when he passed me the bottle of wine. How I hadn't moved away. I told myself it was nothing. Harmless. But it wasn't. The next morning, Evan came down to the kitchen while I was still in my robe. Paul had left early for his golf game. The air was thick with late summer humidity, and my silk robe clung to my skin. I hadn't put on a bra yet. I remember that because when Evan walked in, his eyes flicked to my chest for just a second before he caught himself. And I saw the hesitation, the awareness. "Morning," he said, his voice low and just a little rough from sleep. I pulled the robe tighter, suddenly self-conscious, but also not. "You want coffee?"
God, yes.
"Please." He sat at the island while I poured 2 mugs. I handed him his and felt that moment again. Our fingers touching, just briefly, but it crackled. He looked at me over the rim of the mug. "You always smell like vanilla." I laughed, startled. "That's oddly specific. It's the same perfume you wore years ago." "I remember it." I should have shut it down. "I know that." But I didn't. Instead, I tilted my head and asked, "You notice things like that?" "Only when they matter." It was the way he said it. Quiet, measured, like an invitation, but not a demand. And maybe it was the robe, or the wine from the night before, or the simple truth that I hadn't been looked at like a woman, not a mother, not a wife, in years. Whatever it was, I stood there a little longer than I should have. Close enough to feel the heat from his body. I didn't mean to lean in, but I did. And he didn't move. Our mouths met like it had already happened in some parallel moment we'd both imagined. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate. I felt the press of his hand against my lower back, the soft gasp that escaped me when his lips slid to my neck. His fingers were warm and sure, slipping under the hem of my robe, tracing the curve of my hip. I felt 30 again, no, 20. I felt wanted. When I finally broke the kiss, breathless, I whispered, "We can't." He didn't argue. He just nodded and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I know.
I'm sorry."
But I wasn't. Not really. And neither was he. The rest of the day passed in a strange, heightened quiet. Paul came home, asked about dinner, mentioned the lawn needing work. I nodded and answered like everything was normal. But inside, something had turned. That night, in the shower, I touched myself thinking about Evan. His mouth. His hands. The way he looked at me like I was still vibrant, still desirable. And I knew, deep down, that I had already crossed a line. The question now was how far I would go. I wish I could say that I avoided him the next day. That would have been the logical thing to do. The decent thing. Evan was still staying with us for another 2 nights before heading back to California, and I could have made myself scarce, visited a friend, invented errands, kept my distance. But I didn't. I lingered in the hall longer than I needed to. I waited until I heard him in the kitchen before I came down. I found excuses to brush past him. I wore a sundress with thin straps and no bra, telling myself it was only because of the heat. And he noticed. He never made a move. Not an obvious one anyway. But there were glances that lasted too long, touches that hovered a beat past innocent. And underneath it all was that electric silence, full of all the things we weren't saying. That afternoon, Paul asked if I could handle dinner alone. He was heading to his friend Alan's place to help set up a new smoker. He'd probably be out until late, he said, unless the beer ran out early. I smiled and said of course. I didn't even glance at Evan, who was sitting in the living room reading something on his tablet, barefoot, legs stretched out, a small half-smile playing at his lips. After Paul left, the silence returned. I busied myself in the kitchen, slicing vegetables, pretending to be absorbed in marinating chicken breasts. Evan walked in behind me, barefoot on the tile. I could feel him before I heard him, this subtle awareness, like the change in pressure before a storm. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low and light. "I've got it," I said, not looking up. But he didn't leave. He leaned against the counter, watching me. I could feel his gaze on the slope of my shoulder, the line of my neck. I tried not to react, but my hands moved more carefully, more deliberately. "You cook like it's a ritual," he said. I raised an eyebrow, half laughing. "What does that mean?" "Like you're not just making food. Like you're casting a spell." His words landed somewhere deeper than I expected. I swallowed and focused on the cutting board. "Well, we all need hobbies." He stepped closer, Too close. I felt the warmth of his body behind me. My hands stilled. I haven't stopped thinking about yesterday, he said. I didn't turn around. We shouldn't talk about it. But we will, won't we? I closed my eyes. I felt his breath near my shoulder. My whole body was tense with the ache of wanting and the fear of it. You could walk away right now, I said. Go upstairs.
Pack.
Say goodbye. I could, he said. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out and brushed the hair off the back of my neck, his fingers barely touching my skin. It was such a small thing, so light, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned around slowly, the knife still in my hand. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me like he was waiting for a decision. You're Paul's stepbrother, I said. And you're Paul's wife. The air between us was charged. I could feel my pulse in places I hadn't noticed in years. His hand slid to my waist, resting there like it belonged. I didn't move. I didn't stop him. I've never done anything like this, I said, half to myself. Neither have I. We kissed again, and this time, it wasn't slow. His hands were on my back, pulling me close, his mouth hungry against mine. I dropped the knife and it clattered to the floor, forgotten. I let him lift me onto the counter, my legs wrapping around his hips instinctively. His fingers pushed the strap of my sundress off my shoulder, baring one breast, and his mouth was on me before I could even think about stopping him.
God, I didn't want to stop him.
He was kissing me like he'd been starving. I felt his hands slide under my dress, up my thighs, and I was already wet, already aching. It had been so long since I'd been touched like this, with this kind of need. I gasped when his fingers found me, spreading me open gently, teasing me until my body was shaking against the cold granite countertop. I clung to his shoulders, burying my face in his neck, muffling my cries against his skin. Tell me to stop, he whispered. I couldn't. I wanted him. I wanted everything. I pulled him closer. Don't stop. We didn't even make it to a bedroom. He pulled down his shorts just enough, and I pulled my dress up, the fabric bunching at my waist. I was half naked on the kitchen counter, while the late sun spilled golden light through the window.
It should have felt cheap. It didn't.
It felt raw and urgent and terrifyingly perfect. He slid into me slowly, watching my face the whole time. I gasped at the sensation. Full, stretching, real. I hadn't felt this alive in years. Every nerve in my body woke up, desperate to feel more, deeper, longer. We moved together like we'd done it before, like our bodies remembered something we hadn't yet lived. When I came, it was with a sharp cry that I barely caught in time, biting down on my own hand. He followed seconds later, his forehead resting against mine, both of us breathless. We stayed like that for a moment, sweaty, tangled, stunned. Then we pulled apart in silence. I straightened my dress. He pulled up his shorts. I picked up the knife from the floor and rinsed it, my hands trembling. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both knew what had just happened. Later, we sat at the table and ate dinner like nothing had changed.
We talked about the marinade.
He complimented the potatoes. And when Paul came home, flushed from beer and barbecue smoke, he kissed me on the cheek and asked how the evening had gone. Quiet, I said. Evan poured him a glass of wine. His hands didn't tremble. He was composed.
Calm.
I couldn't stop looking at his mouth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Paul, the scent of Evan still on my skin, a dull ache between my legs. My body was humming, like a radio tuned to a frequency only I could hear. I thought I would feel guilty. I waited for the wave of shame to come. It didn't. Instead, I felt dangerous. Awake. Like someone had cracked a window in a long-closed room and let in fresh air. The next morning, Evan left early to catch his flight. He hugged Paul, thanked him for the hospitality. When he hugged me, it was brief and polite. But he whispered, just for me, I'll call you. And he did. Not right away. Not that night. But 2 days later, while Paul was at work and I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed with a message. Can't stop thinking about you. You okay? I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed back. I'm not okay. I don't think I want to be. The first thing I noticed after Evan left was how empty the house felt, even with Paul still in it. It wasn't that I missed Evan's presence exactly. I wasn't that naive, but the air had changed. The stillness had a different flavor now. More charged. Like the walls were remembering what had happened. I walked through the house differently. I lingered in doorways. I pressed my hand to the edge of the kitchen counter where he'd held me. I avoided the reflection in the mirror above our mantel. I didn't want to see whatever was changing in my face. It took Evan 3 days to text again. When can I see you?
No griting. No pretense.
Just those 5 words, and my heart, traitorous and eager, jumped. I waited nearly 2 hours before replying. I don't know. I can't think straight when you're around. Good, he wrote back. Neither can I. That was the beginning. He came back to town 2 weeks later, ostensibly to help a friend with a gallery show. At least, that's what he told Paul. I didn't ask for the truth. I didn't want the story. I just wanted the hours. I told Paul the first was spending the afternoon at a spa. I even went as far as packing a robe and slippers into a tote bag. I wore light makeup, casual jeans, a white linen shirt, no bra. I don't know what I was trying to be. Natural, maybe, but also desirable. Womanly. The kind of woman Evan had touched and wanted again. He picked me up in a rented car outside a downtown cafe. I slid into the passenger seat, and we didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. I just watched his hands on the wheel, strong and lean, the veins on the back of his hands like fault lines. I thought about those same hands inside me, the sound of his voice against my neck. He drove us to a small rental apartment he'd taken for the weekend. A second-floor walk-up, plain, but clean and full of light. We didn't even make it to the bedroom. As soon as he closed the door behind us, I turned and kissed him. Hard. He pressed me against the wall. His hands slid under my shirt. My jeans were unbuttoned before I could think. He knelt in front of me, pulling them down with practiced slowness, and then his mouth was on me, hot, focused, relentless. I nearly fell. He caught me, lifting me with surprising ease, and carried me to the couch. We never undressed fully, just enough. The urgency was too much. We needed to feel skin, to move, to erase the time between touches. It was fast, rougher than before, less tentative. There was a quiet violence in it, but not in the way that hurt. It was about hunger, about claiming. Afterward, I lay half draped across his chest, our clothes tangled around us. I could hear his heart pounding. I felt lightheaded, but not from guilt, from oxygen, from being touched, wanted undone. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I said, "This is insane." Evan didn't laugh. He traced lazy circles on my back, his voice low. Then, why does it feel better than anything else in my life? I didn't have an answer. We started meeting every 2 weeks. He would come into town for one reason or another, family, business, excuses, and I would find a way to slip out of my life. Always briefly. Always carefully. Paul didn't suspect. Or if he did, he never let on. I was discreet. Ridiculously so. I kept our messages buried in an encrypted app with a generic icon. I turned off notifications. I used a second phone for calls, a burner I kept in a sewing basket I hadn't touched in years. I watched myself doing these things, creating a hidden world, a version of me that only Evan saw. At night, I would lie in bed beside Paul, warm from his body, steady in his breathing, and I would hate myself for not missing him. Because I didn't. That was the worst part. I didn't feel like I was betraying some grand romance. Paul and I were companions now. Comfortable. Predictable. We laughed. We shared meals. We went to bed early and talked about errands. He hadn't touched me with real desire in years. Not like Evan. With Evan, it wasn't just the sex, though the sex was extraordinary. It was the way he listened. The way he noticed. He remembered things I said in passing, my favorite scent, the book I hadn't finished, the song that made me cry. He looked at me like I was still unfolding, still surprising. Sometimes we would lie in bed afterward and just talk. I told him things I hadn't told anyone. How I used to dream of traveling alone. How I missed the person I thought I would be. How sometimes I felt like I had fallen asleep at 40 and was waking up at 52 in a body that didn't quite fit. He would kiss my shoulder and say, "You fit me." And I believed him. Once, after a long afternoon in a lakeside motel, I asked him, "Do you think you'll ever fall in love with someone you're allowed to have?" He looked at me, half smiling, eyes distant. "I think I already did.
Once.
A long time ago." That stayed with me. I never asked who he meant. There were moments when I tried to stop. I would wake up early and make coffee and tell myself, "This has to end. You have a husband. You have a life. You're not a girl anymore." But then a message would come. Wednesday, noon, same place. And I'd reply, "Yes." What made it worse and more impossible to quit was that being with Evan didn't make me feel younger. It made me feel present, like the years hadn't passed unnoticed, like I was still in this body, this skin, this life. One afternoon, as I sat across from him at a small wine bar downtown, he reached across the table and took my hand. "You ever think about what this could be?" he asked. I stared at him. "You mean if we didn't have to lie?" He nodded slowly. I hesitated. "Sometimes." His thumb stroked mine. "I think about it more than I should." I smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Evan, you're Paul's family. I'm Paul's wife." His jaw flexed. "I'm not his blood. And you're more than someone's wife." I didn't answer. I looked out the window, watching the people pass. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to leave Paul for Evan. But I also didn't want to lose Evan. And that truth made the rest of my life feel like a house I was squatting in, comfortable, familiar, but no longer mine. That night, I stood in the shower longer than usual, let the hot water run down my back until my skin turned red. I kept thinking about the look on Evan's face. How careful he'd been with his words. How careful I had not been with my heart. I stepped out of the steam, wrapped in a towel, and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked older than I remembered, but also, strangely, more alive. Autumn came quietly that year, the way it often does when you're not paying attention. One morning, I stepped outside to get the mail and felt the shift in the air, cooler, crisper, tinged with the faintest scent of damp leaves and something distant, like memory. I stood there barefoot on the porch, staring at nothing, letting the wind move through me like it might carry something away. Evan hadn't texted in 4 days. That didn't mean much on its own. He traveled, he worked, he sometimes went quiet. But I felt it. A stillness that unsettled me, like the pause before a storm. At night, I found myself checking my burner phone more than I should have. I'd turn the volume up just enough to hear a buzz. Then back down. Then up again. Paul didn't notice. Or if he did, he mistook my restlessness for midlife melancholy. He'd started suggesting we go away for a weekend. Somewhere with vineyards. Somewhere we could reconnect. I smiled when he brought it up. "Sure," I told him. "Maybe October." But I was already imagining how I'd lie to Evan about it. Instead, Evan called first. It was just after 10 on a Tuesday morning. I was still in my robe, sitting on the edge of the bed, sipping coffee. I didn't recognize the number at first. He never called me from his main line, but I answered on instinct. "Hello. Are you alone?" His voice was low.
Urgent.
I stood up without realizing it.
Yes.
"What's wrong?"
A pause.
Then, "I think Paul suspects something." My heart dropped.
What? Why?
"Did he say something?" "No, not directly. He called me last night out of nowhere. Asked a lot of strange questions. Kept circling around you. Around us." I sat back down, suddenly cold despite the sun in the window. "What did you say?" I kept it neutral. Told him, "I haven't seen you since the 4th of July. But I'm telling you now because if he knows or even guesses, this could unravel fast." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Okay. I'll be careful." "More than careful," he said. We stopped texting for a while. No calls. If we see each other, it has to be public. Controlled. I hated how calm he sounded, like he was pulling away already. "And us?" I asked quietly. Another pause. Not ending. just minimizing risk. I closed my eyes. Okay. We hung up without saying goodbye. For days after that, I felt like I was moving through fog. I went about my routines, groceries, cooking, laundry, but I was watching myself like a character I didn't quite believe. The guilt I'd managed to suppress all summer came roaring back, not for what I'd done, but for how much I wanted to keep doing it. Paul didn't seem suspicious, not directly, but I could feel him watching me more closely. He'd lean in when I was on the phone, linger longer when he kissed me goodbye in the morning. He made small gestures, bringing flowers, offering back rubs, cleaning out the garage without being asked. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought he was falling in love with me again. But I did know better. What he was doing wasn't love. It was marking territory. Instinctual, protective. The quiet response of a man who sensed something slipping and didn't know how to name it. Evan and I didn't see each other for nearly 3 weeks. And when we did, it was brief, desperate, and different. We met in the corner of a wine bar, barely speaking, just sipping from a shared glass and brushing knees beneath the table. Every touch felt loaded. Every word too loud. I followed him to his car after dark, and we kissed in the back seat like teenagers, our hands frantic, our bodies cramped and tense. He slid his hand up my thigh, and I stopped him. Not because I didn't want it, but because I was too aware of where we were, of who might walk by, of how thin the veil had become between this world and the one I was supposed to be living in. He leaned back, frustrated, breath ragged. "I miss you," he said into my neck. "I feel like I'm going crazy." "You're not the only one," I whispered. And then I did something I hadn't done before. I started to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears that I couldn't stop, that wet the collar of his jacket and made me feel, for the first time in months, completely undone. He held me. Not sexually.
Just held me.
His hand stroking the back of my head, his body warm and still.
We didn't speak again that night.
When I got home, Paul was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. He smiled when he saw me. "Hey, you're home late. How was Karen?" I blinked.
Karen. Right.
I'd said I was meeting her for a movie. It was fine. Long but good. He kissed my cheek. "You smell like Merlot." I laughed, forced. Guilty. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. I didn't want to stop seeing Evan. But I also couldn't pretend this wasn't getting dangerous. Not just logistically. Emotionally. Spiritually. I had started to divide myself too cleanly. Wife on one side, lover on the other. And now those lines were beginning to blur. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my face. Really looked. The lines around my eyes. The softness at my jaw. The way my mouth turned down when I wasn't smiling. I looked older. I was older. But I didn't feel old. I felt alive. Torn, yes. But not dead inside. Not numb. And that meant something. I didn't want to lose Evan. But I also didn't want to destroy everything I'd built. Paul wasn't a monster. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't neglected me. He was just safe. Predictable. The man I'd chosen in a different decade, with a different version of myself. But who was I now? One day, in early October, Evan sent a letter. A real one. In the mail. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, tucked among catalogs and charity flyers. My hands trembled when I opened it. It wasn't long. Just a page. He wrote, "I don't know how this ends. I don't even know if it can end. You're in me now, in the way I see the world, in the spaces between my thoughts. I don't regret a single moment, but I'm afraid. Afraid that we're going to burn everything down just to keep something that can't survive in daylight. But even knowing that, I want you again. I want to see you.
Talk to you.
Touch you. Not in secret. Not like this. But I know what's at stake. And I'll follow your lead, whatever it is. Just tell me what you want." I folded the letter and put it in my underwear drawer, beneath a pile of silk I hadn't worn in years. Then I stood there for a long time, not moving. I didn't know what I wanted. That night, Paul brought home Thai takeout and played jazz on the record player like it was 1998. We drank wine. He asked about the neighbors. Asked about his mother. We laughed. We watched a movie. We made love. It was slow, tender,
Familiar.
but afterward I lay on my side, eyes open, and I thought about Evan's letter,
His hands.
his hunger, his hope. And I felt the crack widen just a little more. The seasons kept turning. October faded into November, and with it, the ritual of golden leaves and chilly dusk walks gave way to heavier coats, earlier sunsets, and the subtle descent into winter. But inside me, something stayed suspended, like time had started running on two tracks. One was still, domestic, reliable. The other? Always on the verge of spinning out. Paul, and I took that weekend trip he'd been suggesting since summer. Wine country, just like he'd wanted, bed and breakfast, scheduled tastings, a fireplace in the room. He booked a couple's massage. Bought me a scarf I said I liked. Touched my hand across the table like he used to. I smiled.
Laughed.
Kissed him back. Slept beside him under a thick white comforter in a room scented with eucalyptus and bergamot.
But I was somewhere else the whole time.
I didn't bring the burner phone. Evan and I had agreed, radio silence for a few weeks. Still, I checked my regular phone more than necessary. Hoped for a message. Dreaded one at the same time. I imagined Evan alone in his place, maybe going over that same letter again, wondering if I'd throw it away or frame it or never read it at all. He didn't know I kept it in the drawer with my favorite lingerie, beneath pieces Paul hadn't touched in years. On the last night of the trip, Paul brought out a small velvet box over dinner. I froze. "It's not what you think," he said quickly, grinning. No vows to renew. Just, I thought it was time for something new. Inside was a pair of earrings, simple, tasteful, pale blue stones and silver. "I wanted to remind you," he said, reaching across the table, "that I still notice you. That I still want you." It hit me in a strange way. Not with guilt, not even with regret, but with something colder. The realization that he was trying, genuinely trying, and I had already left him in ways he couldn't yet see. When we got home, the routines resumed, but something between us shifted. Paul was more present than usual. He made more eye contact, touched my waist in the kitchen, sat closer to me on the couch. It was sweet and suffocating. Meanwhile, Evan stayed quiet for almost a month. Then, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I opened my front door to find a plain brown box on the porch. No label, no return address. Inside was a scarf, green cashmere. Deep, moody, expensive. It still smelled faintly of Evan's cologne, and nestled beneath it was a note. "I saw this and thought of you. Because it's soft, yes. But also because it hides fire. I miss the fire. I'll be at the lake house next Friday. If you come, leave your wedding ring in your car." The lake house. It had been empty since the summer, technically still in his father's name, but Evan had full access now. He'd mentioned it before as neutral ground, but we never used it. Too risky. Too exposed.
But now?
It was winter. Off-season. Quiet. And I was burning. The night after Thanksgiving, Paul fell asleep early, full from turkey leftovers and half a bottle of wine. I sat beside him for a long time, just watching the rise and fall of his chest. He didn't stir when I slipped off the couch or when I packed an overnight bag. I left the ring on my nightstand, but remembered at the last second and moved it into the drawer, beneath the letter. Somehow that felt safer, like I was putting both things on pause. The lake house was 2 hours away. I drove through dark, empty roads, headlights cutting through mist. My pulse thudded the whole way. By the time I reached the gravel driveway, my hands were damp. Evan opened the door before I could knock. He looked different, scruffier, like he hadn't shaved in days. His eyes were heavy but alert, as if he hadn't been sleeping but had been waiting for this exact moment. I stepped inside. Neither of us said anything. Not at first. He just pulled me into him, mouth to my temple, arms tight. We didn't rush. We didn't speak. It wasn't about sex, not yet. He poured us whiskey. We sat on the couch in silence, the fire crackling low in the background. Then, finally, "I wasn't sure you'd come." I stared into the amber in my glass. I wasn't sure either. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I know we're living on a thread, that it's fragile and impossible and stupid, but I'm not good at pretending this isn't real. It is real, I said quietly. That's the problem. We didn't undress each other like before. We peeled ourselves down slowly, cautiously, like we needed to memorize each movement. His touch was different this time, less urgent, more reverent. When he finally entered me, we both let out the same breath. I don't know how long we moved together. It felt like hours. It felt like no time at all. There was a moment, his mouth on my breast, my fingers twisted in his hair, where everything else dissolved. The guilt, the distance, even Paul. All of it faded into the background of the firelight. After, we lay tangled on the old quilt, bare and quiet. He traced lazy lines on my back. I wish we were the ones who'd met first, he said. I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't hurt.
We spent the whole weekend there. I didn't call Paul.
He didn't text me. I told myself I deserved one unfiltered moment. One selfish stretch of time before the consequences returned. We talked more than we ever had. About his childhood. About my early marriage. About books we loved. Places we'd never gone. The weird way time warps when you're living a lie. On Sunday morning, he cooked eggs and toast while I sat barefoot on the counter in his sweatshirt. Let's leave, he said suddenly, eyes locked on mine. I blinked. Leave. Everything. Just go. Rent a place for a month. Or longer. No rules.
No lain.
Just see what this actually is. My breath caught. I have a life, Evan. A husband. A home. You also have this. He pointed between us. And you didn't walk away. I didn't answer. Not then. But I didn't walk away either. When I got back Sunday night, Paul was reading in bed. He looked up, smiled, kissed me on the cheek. How is Karen? I nodded. Good. She needed company. He reached for my hand, squeezed it. Glad you were there for her. I went into the bathroom and threw up. Not from sickness. From shame. But even after all that, I couldn't bring myself to stop. In the days that followed, Evan and I fell into a new rhythm. Coded emails, encrypted messages, burner calls from hotel parking lots. The secrecy became its own drug. Risk sharpened everything. Made it hotter. More urgent. But also more dangerous. Paul started looking at me differently. One night, he asked, "Is there something you're not telling me?" I froze. What do you mean? I don't know, he said slowly. You're distant lately. Distracted. Like you're somewhere else. I forced a laugh. I'm just tired. The holidays, everything. He didn't push. But the seed was planted. Evan started talking more seriously about leaving town. He sent me links to apartments. Suggested I look into freelance work I could do remotely. It wasn't just fantasy anymore. I'd take care of you, he said. You wouldn't have to worry. But I was worried. Not just about money or Paul or being found out. I was worried about what would happen when the dust settled. When Evan and I weren't playing hide and seek in borrowed spaces. When real life returned. Was the fire enough to build a life on? Or was it only beautiful because it was borrowed? The holidays came like a slow avalanche. Every garland, every wreath on a neighbor's door, every damn cinnamon-scented candle felt like a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. One of tidy traditions. Of eggnog and shared sweaters and photo cards of smiling couples in front of snow-covered trees. But inside, everything was unraveling. I decorated the house with Paul like always. Hung the same lights along the banister, the same glass icicles on the front-facing window. We played Nat King Cole and sipped hot toddies on the couch. He kissed me under the mistletoe, and I kissed him back with closed eyes, hiding my betrayal in warmth and ritual. And all the while, Evan was sending me little pieces of the life we could be living. Apartment listings in Asheville. A cozy A-frame rental in Vermont. A secluded bungalow in Santa Fe with a wraparound porch and room for a ridiculous amount of books and coffee mugs, as he put it. He was ready to leave. To walk away from everything. I don't want to be the reason you shatter a life, he told me once, voice low and honest in the dark. But I also don't want to be the man who watches you keep settling for almost happy. That was what I was now, almost happy. It was a feeling I knew too well. And it terrified me. Paul started sensing things. Not proof, not facts, just ripples in the water. One night, as I was folding laundry, he stood in the doorway and said, "You don't laugh with me the way you used to." I kept folding. "What do you mean?" "I mean I know your laugh," he said gently. "The real one. It hasn't been around much." That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, the ring on my finger feeling heavier than usual. Not from guilt, but from weariness. I had built a life out of small compromises and quiet nods. I had been faithful in every visible way for decades, until suddenly I wasn't. But the affair hadn't come from lust alone. It had come from a deeper fracture, from being seen too little for too long. Evan had simply cracked the surface and slipped inside. We planned to meet just before Christmas, one more time before the holiday tide swept us into family events and obligations. A small cabin in the Berkshires, barely 2 hours from home. Evan booked it under a fake name. I told Paul the first was going to visit a college friend recovering from surgery. He nodded.
Take your time.
I'll hold down the fort. I watched him chop vegetables for dinner, wearing that apron with the wine stain he never noticed. And I wondered if he'd ever stop loving me, even if I shattered his heart completely. That Friday, I packed light. One change of clothes, warm tights, a soft black sweater Evan once said made me look like trouble in the best way. I left my ring on the nightstand again, hidden under a copy of the Paris Review. It snowed the entire drive. By the time I reached the cabin, everything was dusted in white, clean and silent. I found Evan already there, fire roaring, eyes full of something unreadable. We barely spoke at first. Just touched. Undressed. Let our bodies talk for us. It was different again, less desperate, more grounded. There was no rush.
No frenzy.
Just a long, slow burn that unfolded over hours. He explored me like he hadn't before, like he wasn't just learning my body but learning me. When it was over, he stayed inside me for minutes after, breath warm against my ear, hands flat on my lower back, grounding me. Then we talked. And this time, we didn't hold back. He told me he'd already spoken to his employer about remote work, that he'd put in notice at his apartment. "I've never been this sure about anything," he said. I sat up in bed, the blanket clutched to my chest, heart hammering. "Even if it means blowing up everything?" He nodded. "Especially then." I stared out the frosted window, watched the slow drift of snow under the porch light. The world looked clean, untouched. But I wasn't. "I love you," I whispered. It was the first time I'd said it. He said it back, without hesitation. Pulled me into him like a man anchoring himself in a storm. That night, I barely slept. I watched him sleep instead. His lashes, the curve of his mouth, the way his chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm. I imagined waking up beside him every day.
Coffee in bed.
Lazy mornings. A quiet apartment filled with the smell of toasted bread and books stacked on every surface. Then I imagined telling Paul. I imagined his face when I told him I'd been unfaithful. That it wasn't just physical. That I had fallen. That I was leaving. When I got home, it was late Sunday night. Paul was in the living room, watching a documentary with a half-empty mug of cocoa on the table. He looked up, smiled. "She doing okay?" I didn't answer right away. He paused the TV. "Everything all right?" I sat down across from him, hands trembling, and I told him the truth. Not all at once. Not the whole story, but enough. That there was someone else. That it wasn't new. That it wasn't meaningless. That I hadn't made up my mind, but something had shifted in me, and I couldn't unfeel it. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just sat there, absorbing it. After a long silence, he asked, "Do I know him?" I shook my head.
No.
Another lie. A necessary one. He nodded slowly. "Are you in love with him?"
I didn't speak.
My silence was answer enough. He got up without a word, went into the bedroom, and shut the door. I stayed on the couch until sunrise. The next weeks were a blur. Paul didn't kick me out. He didn't beg me to stay either. We moved around each other like ghosts, polite and broken. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I didn't know, that I needed time. But I did know. I just wasn't brave enough yet to say it out loud. Evan kept asking. Not pressuring. Just waiting. Patient. Hopeful. Sometimes sad. On New Year's Eve, I stood alone on the back porch with a glass of champagne, watching the sky darken over the trees. Fireworks cracked in the distance. Somewhere inside, Paul turned up the TV to drown them out. And I knew. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep performing the role of a woman I no longer was. I packed my things 2 days later. Not everything, just enough.
Books. Clothes.
A photo or two. The scarf Evan gave me. The letter. When I turned the key in the ignition, my hands were shaking. Paul stood in the doorway, arms crossed. No expression. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said. Tears slid down my cheeks, but I didn't stop driving. Evan was waiting. The apartment was small. Nothing glamorous. But it smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. He opened the door and pulled me inside like someone afraid I might disappear again. We didn't say anything that night. We just held each other. Not in lust.
Not in shame.
But in love.
Real.
Complicated. Unforgiving. Beautiful. Messy love. The kind that leaves a scar. But also, the kind that makes you feel alive again. Even at 54. Maybe especially then.